Mr. Speaker.
I call Kevin Haig.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It seems to be a bit of a theme in this Parliament, and perhaps the last one, to be overhauling or amending ancient legislation. And when we look at those bills, it becomes readily apparent that they were drawn up in, I guess, simpler ages where circumstances were somewhat different. I must say, in contrast to the radiation safety bill that the House was dealing with some weeks ago, it's certainly a pleasure not to have the National Party members filling their speeches with reminiscences of the songs of 1953 that they recall. Mr. Speaker, the 1953, as Scott Simpson was saying, a simpler time perhaps, where understanding of conservation practice was more primitive, but perhaps also a time where New Zealanders' sense of collective responsibility was stronger. And as Scott Simpson was saying, a time when perhaps just the uniform of, I guess, what was then a Forest Service ranger would have been enough to ensure compliance. There has been some updating of the Act in the intervening years, and in her contribution the Minister referred to the bill sponsored through this Parliament by Jackie Dean. Kate Wilkinson was also concerned with the issue of penalties under the Wildlife Act, because the penalties that were imposed in 1953 were simply inadequate to provide any kind of disincentive to those who were motivated to break the law. I guess my frustration with those attempts to change the Act, both increasing the penalties and now on this occasion ramping up the enforcement powers that dock rangers have, is that they have been piecemeal attempts rather than a comprehensive overhaul of the Act. And they've also been very reactive. So it was the high-profile cases of lizards being smuggled, of native birds being shot, that actually prompted a particular action, but they didn't prompt a comprehensive review and modernisation of the Act. And that's what we actually require. In his wide-ranging contribution, David Parker spoke about the importance of habitat. And indeed, one of the issues with the Wildlife Act is that it focuses very much on individual species. And part of what we know now is, as part of modern conservation practice, is that focus on individual species is almost worthless. We need to see species in ecosystem terms and in relation to their habitats. And a modern Wildlife Act would have that kind of focus. The other aspect, I guess, that the bill could be considering and an enlightened government would be doing in an overhaul of the Act would be to really address the emergency that we face in threatened and endangered species in this country. But actually, if we consider amphibians, almost all of them are critically endangered. The same applies to reptiles, to many of our birds. We have the highest proportion of the species in this country, of any country on Earth, that are endangered. And yet, of that vast list of endangered species, only a very small number actually have active protection plans. That's why, Mr. Speaker, I have a bill in the ballot also to amend the Wildlife Act to actually require New Zealand to do what the United States has done, what Canada has done, what many other countries have done, and that is when we identify a species as endangered, there then becomes a responsibility on the state, on behalf of us all, to put in place a plan to recover and protect that species, very often in the context of its ecosystem and the habitat that may be threatened. So, Mr. Speaker, the Green Party will certainly be supporting this bill to the Select Committee, and in the Select Committee process there's several issues that we're going to be specifically looking for. We're going to be asking, are these powers enough? You know, are these powers going to be adequate to achieve the purpose that's set out in the bill? I noted with great interest and some horror the Minister's comment that there wouldn't be specific extra training, that rangers were considered to be already trained enough. Mr. Speaker, I find that quite extraordinary. I'm going to be teasing that out at Select Committee. On the other side of the ledger, I guess whenever we have a bill that is expanding enforcement powers, it is appropriate for us to be asking, are these coercive powers appropriately balanced with other rights and freedoms that people should have, such as those set out in the Bill of Rights, such as privacy rights? Has that balance been struck in the correct place? I'm also concerned, Mr. Speaker, because in many ways the extra powers that rangers will have as a result of this bill, if it passes, those powers are similar in kind to the extra powers that fisheries officers have. And we know from experience, sir, that fisheries officers are indeed sometimes subject to threat or to physical violence. And that might be a new dimension, a new threat faced by conservation rangers that has not been faced to date. So it will be a matter of great interest what planning has been done by the department and by the government to ensure that our conservation rangers are appropriately protected from those additional threats. Mr. Speaker, I was also astonished to hear from the Minister that the government does not consider that these new powers will require any more resourcing for the Department of Conservation. And Mr. Speaker, I just cannot see how that can be. We hear pretty well daily of fresh situations where the Department of Conservation is unable to carry out its basic functions because it is cash-strapped. It doesn't have the resources to perform those roles. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yet this seems to be another case of expecting the department to do more with less. Well, Mr. Speaker, you know, I come from the West Coast. Others have been mentioning their areas, and I have been recently concerned by the inland pack track in the Paparoa National Park. The main track in that national park currently closed in one part of that track because of damage from Cyclone Ita. The Department of Conservation reckons that the cost of repairing that will be $62,000, which it doesn't have. So it's been calling for volunteers to come and repair the main track in one of our national parks. Mr. Speaker, when this government came to power, it reduced the baseline funding for the Department of Conservation by $35 million, approximately a drop of 10%. And since that time, that baseline funding has not only been kept at that low level, it has reduced further. It is hardly surprising that the basic functions that New Zealanders expect from the Department of Conservation to protect the species, the ecosystems and the habitats that we love, that the Minister spoke of in quoting Don Merton in her speech, it is hardly surprising that the department is failing to meet those expectations. So, Mr. Speaker, we're going to be looking, when this bill is considered, at whether or not the government will in fact adequately resource these extra functions the department is being asked to perform. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Speaker.